They don't have to pay any taxes.
That was easy.
Boy, the Federal Reserve Act.
That was easy.
Brought to us when? December 23rd, 1913, could it be?
That was easy.
Written and done by bankers?
That was easy.
For bankers?
That was easy.
Why would they care about interest if they can make currency from nothing?
That was easy.
Just by pressing a button.
That was easy.
Electronic money.
That was easy.
And they could buy anything.
That was
They might even be able to buy politicians.
That was easy.
Maybe even representatives from Massachusetts.
That was easy.
Maybe representatives that people call Barney. Who knows? You know, if you have money
That was easy.
that's as easy to make as pushing a button, what do you care about the interest? If you made pizzas for a living, and pizzas were the means of exchange, so you make pizzas by pressing a button, do you care if somebody gives you back pizzas with, what, an extra slice in the morning? The interest means I'd have to have, what, accountants?
That was easy.
What do I need interest for? I can make the currency.
That was easy. That was easy.
And think about it. The currency that we use now, we put their symbols on it, don't we? This is almost like a spell that's been cast. This is almost a cult because it's hidden. Isn't that what a cult means? Hidden. So it's hidden. We can't see the books. They're privately owned, right? Wait a minute.
That was easy.
You mean they're not public?
That was easy.
They're not part of our government? Or is Federal Express, the shipping company, part of our government?
That was easy.
So they hide, and they don't have to pay taxes,
That was easy.
and they create currency
That was easy.
by pressing a button.
That was easy.
And they get you believing that the interest is important. And they get you paying taxes.
That was easy.
So the government collect that, taxes, and pay them interest.
Easy. That was easy.
And they create money this easy.
That was easy.
Do you honestly believe they care about the interest? Maybe this is about control.
That was easy.
How would you get control?
That was easy.
What's the easiest way to get control?
That was easy.
Is it time for a quote from Mayer Rothschild, who said, "I care not who makes the laws, as long as I make the currency."
That was easy.
That was a good quote for you, wasn't it? So anyway, we're told
That was easy.
that interest is important to the Federal Reserve because they create money
That was easy.
by pressing buttons.
That was easy.
They don't have any reserves. They're not part of our federal government. They're separate from it. Yet they create currency by pressing a button.
Easy.
And you're told it's important, the interest. Do you see the spell they've cast upon? And now, because our currency is the global reserve currency, and it won't be that way for long. So now international bankers control our Federal Reserve and international royal families, and you think
That was easy.
that they work for you.
That was easy.
I made some more currency for you.
That was easy.
Hey, you know, they bailed people out.
That was easy.
Did they bail you out?
That was easy.
What happened in Germany?
That was easy.
What happened to the Reichsmark?
That was easy.
Do you know what happened in the 20s, 1920s in Germany?
That was easy.
How about the 30s?
That was easy.
How did Hitler get into power?
That was easy.
Who funded Hitler rise to power?
That was easy.
Who was Prescott Bush? Here's a little clip so you know what what's going on in the world, just so you cover a little bit of history for you.
Later in the McCormack-Dickstein report, a shipping company called Hamburg America Line was accused of providing free passage to Germany to American journalists willing to write favourable copy on Hitler's rise to power. The company is also alleged to have brought Nazi spies and pro-fascist sympathisers into America. John Buchanan has studied this later section of the report and has discovered that one of the company's managers came from a very famous family.
The thing that surprised me most was to discover in the documents that this company, Hamburg America Lines, had in fact been managed on the U.S. side at the executive level by Prescott Bush as part of a web of Nazi business interests that were all seized in late 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act by the U.S. Congress, and Prescott Bush is the grandfather of the sitting president of the United States.
Of course, at the time, it was perfectly legal to have dealings with Hitler's Germany. Prescott Bush was not called to account for this until America entered the war. Neither was it a crime to be a member of a lobby group like the Liberty League, and have found no firm evidence that the Liberty League itself was behind the plot to overthrow their country's democratically elected president. But academics like Professor Tony Badger believes that it was, at the very least, a magnet for those with such intentions.
It would always surprise me if there had been a lot of very fine-tuned planning. But the sense that forces that might be unleashed by the New Deal pose such a threat that desperate measures might be needed does ring true.
But yet again, the evidence is hard to find. You'd have thought that if there was any linking leading American industrialists of the day to a plot against the president, I'd be able to find it at the National Archives in Washington. Yet when John Buchanan and I leafed through the rather thin files there, we found no direct reference to any of these people.
A little bit of Bush history, huh? Yeah. So, you've learned that there's a private banking cartel, and if you don't think they're private, I suggest you go buy a share of their stock. You know, let's find out if they're public. You buy a share of their stock, you come on my show. Because you know I like to follow the money. We'll follow your money. You buy a share of the Federal Reserve.
That was easy.
They make money by pressing buttons.
That was easy.
And they don't have to pay taxes.
That was easy.
Do they have to pay taxes?
That was easy.
Have you read the Federal Reserve Act?
That was easy.
Why don't you look at Section 8B?
That was easy.
Yeah. So I ask you, is it just almost like a spell that they've cast upon you to make you think that this currency's worth value? You know, they write stuff on the currency. They write legal tender. There's legal tender laws to force you to use their money. If you don't, you can be arrested.
That was easy.
Maybe we should all read George Orwell's book, Animal Farm.
That was easy. That was easy.
How did the pigs take over the farm?
That was easy.
Did they use the dogs as muscle?
That was easy.
Or maybe the bankers
That was easy.
use the government as muscle
That was easy.
to make you pay taxes.
That was easy.
Meanwhile, if you go in the inner city,
That was easy.
they'll steal money, just like they do in rural situations.
That was easy.
They'll steal your stuff and trade it for money.
That was easy.
They'll invade countries for commodities, for resources.
That was easy.
They'll enslave people.
That was easy.
They'll spend $450 million a day just to keep wars going.
That was easy.
Do bankers fund both sides of the warring parties?
That was easy.
Oh, wait. I think I'll make some more currency.
That was easy.
Do you think I care if I get interest? Interest is crumbs.
That was easy.
When I can make money by pressing a button.
That was easy.
Wouldn't you like to make money by pressing a button?
That was easy.
You know, we had a president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He was the last one to go against the bankers.
That was easy.
Do you remember what happened to him?
That was easy.
And in the 70s, they have hearings, and they say, yep, the CIA was involved.
That was easy.
You don't think this? What do you think the CIA is doing this week?
That was easy.
Who do you think the CIA works for? The Cocaine Importation Agency. Who do you think they work for?
That was easy.
Who created Al Qaeda?
That was easy.
Could they work for the bankers?
That was easy.
Who make currency from nothing?
That was easy.
Is there anything they couldn't buy once again?